Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. In this series, we're looking at the historical background of the Bible. We'll look at different periods of time that historians and archaeologists use as they look at the ancient world, as well as a few important people and places along the way. We'll also look at a few ways these historical overviews can help us see the Bible in its context. In this video, we're going to continue our look at the Iron Age. The Iron Age, the period following the Bronze Age, lasted from roughly 1200 BC until the 6th century BC. In the southern Levant, the area of the world where much of the Bible takes place, it's divided into two periods. We covered the early Iron Age, which spans roughly 2 centuries from 1200 BC until 1000 BC, in last week's video. The later Iron Age, the Iron Age II, or just Iron II, spans the rest of the period from about 1000 BC until the early 6th century. It can be further divided into the Iron IIA, Iron IIB, and Iron IIC, but today we'll cover the Iron II as a single cultural period. The Iron Age is a cultural period, like the Bronze Age, but at the end of the Bronze Age, historians change how they classify historical periods in this part of the world. After the Iron Age, breaks in periodization follow historical developments more than they do cultural changes. For the region of Judah, the Iron Age ended in 586 BC with the destruction of Jerusalem by the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Historical periods after this are named for the dominant empires at the time, such as the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. We'll cover these later periods in a future series of videos. For now, let's explore what happened during Iron Age II.
In the southern Levant, the Iron Age II is marked by what's called nucleation of the rural agrarian settlements of the Iron I. Now, some small villages were abandoned, others stayed small villages, and a few others grew in size to become cities. And this marks the appearance of what archaeologists call monumental architecture. This is architecture which is of an elevated scale, or has ornamentation which exceeds the practical needs of the structure's intended function. Monumental architecture includes fortifications like walls and gates, large storehouses or warehouses which have a governmental or public function, and palaces or residences of government officials. All of these types of structures appear in the southern Levant during the Iron II. The settlement pattern shifts from a network of exclusively rural agrarian villages to one that is tiered with different sized cities and villages. This shift, along with the introduction of monumental architecture, points to an increase in the level of complexity of society during this period. This shift is often associated with socio-political developments. In the case of the Southern Levant and the Iron II, it should be associated with the rise of the Israelite state and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. These kingdoms are attested both archaeologically and historically. Archaeologists have excavated numerous sites from both kingdoms and have even isolated cultural distinctions between the north and the south. For example, by the mid-8th century in Judah, we find a type of storage jar which is recognizable by its form and wear all by itself. And these jars are called Lamellar Jars because some of these jars have stamp seal impressions on their handles. These impressions typically have either a winged beetle or a winged disc with the Hebrew phrase Lamelech, meaning for the king or belonging to the king, along with the name of a settlement. The purpose of these Lamellar jars is a little bit debated. Two popular theories state that they were for military rations or taxation. And whatever the purpose, it is clear that these jars were from a centralized authority. The centralization of authority in Judah was greatly expanded under Hezekiah in his preparation for rebellion against Assyria. The Lamellar jars were almost certainly used as part of these preparations, but it isn't clear if they were initiated as part of those preparations or adapting a pre-existing system. Now, these ceramic vessels only appear in Judah, as they were used by the Judahite state. So just one example of how we can recognize the kingdoms of Israel and Judah archaeologically. There are a lot of debates within archaeological circles about when Israel and Judah actually emerged as states and not some other kind of entity like a chiefdom. There's also debate about where the boundaries of these states were. There's no doubt, however, that these kingdoms did exist because it's clear they interacted with the wider world. We have references to both of these kingdoms in textual sources from elsewhere in the ancient Near East. For example, Assyrian sources refer to the kingdom of Israel as Beit Omri, or the House of Omri, This reflects the tradition of calling a nation after their supposed founder, in this case Omri, the father of Ahab. While this doesn't reflect what the Bible tells us regarding the founders of the Kingdom of Israel, the Omar Dynasty was certainly the most significant and successful dynasty in the Northern Kingdom. We even have a depiction of a king of Israel. On this stela, called the Black Obelisk, erected by the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III, we actually see someone who is called Jehu, son of Omri, who is bowing down before the king of Assyria. Some of this inscription goes against the biblical account, which describes Jehu as not being an Omride. In fact, Jehu kills most of the Omride dynasty. The kingdom of Judah is also mentioned in non-biblical sources. In the Tel Dan stela, there is a reference to Judah. This particular stela was likely commissioned by the Aramean king Hazael. It is in hard basalt stone and its inscription is written in Aramaic. It was actually found in what's called secondary use, meaning the stela had originally been put in some public place but had since been knocked down, and the stone, being a really good hard rock, was reused in a building. Archaeologists were excavating at the site of Tel Dan and they found the stone, flipped it over, and found this incredible inscription. In the inscription it mentions Beit David, or a house of David. Like the Assyrians, who referred to Israel as the house of Omri after its presumed founder, here we see Judah being named after its founder, David. The phrase House of David may also appear on a Moabite inscription. The so-called Mesha stela was found at the site of Dibon. When it was found, they took what is called a squeeze, which is a way of preserving the inscription where pulp or shredded paper is put in the inscription and a binding agent solidifies it, kind of like paper mache. It's a good thing they did that, because the stone was later shattered and parts of it have gone missing. Well, in line 31 of the inscription, the text is missing some letters and scholars have tried to reconstruct what it says. One option is that it's referring to Beit David or Judah, though this is still debated, even as some quite recent studies use new imaging technology to better analyze the artifact. So whether this refers to the House of David or not, it is impressive evidence for the Kingdom of Moab. These artifacts are some of the more sensational ones, which attest to biblical figures and events. But there are numerous other artifacts and accounts which have bearing on the Old Testament world. Many of these accounts come from the records of the imperial powers of the day, like the Neo-Assyrians and the short-lived Neo-Babylonians. They give us a clearer picture of how Israel and Judah interacted with their wider ancient Near Eastern context. In the 10th and 9th centuries, the nations of Israel and Judah may actually have been significant forces in the ancient world. At the 9th century Battle of Karkar, the Israelites under Ahab, including his allies and vassals like Judah, they were part of a coalition of Syrian and Levantine forces opposing the Assyrians. The Israelite contingent actually provided the largest chariot force of all the coalition forces. In the 9th century, the primary antagonists of these kingdoms were the Arameans, with kings like Hazael and Ben-Hadad. In the 8th century, the Assyrian Empire became the dominant power in the region, with the rise to power of the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III. Israel and Judah's fates became tied to the wider world of the Assyrians. Assyrian kings led numerous campaigns into the lands of Israel and Judah. This includes the destruction of Samaria in 722 under Shalmaneser V, and Sennacherib's campaign against Hezekiah and Judah. This campaign under Sennacherib is particularly important for archaeologists because Sennacherib celebrated it on wall reliefs at his palace. These reliefs show Sennacherib's siege of the Judahite city of Lachish, a significant fortress of Judah. Sennacherib says, "As for Hezekiah, like a caged bird I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city." It's unclear from the Assyrian sources if he took the city, but the biblical account indicates he did not. Instead, it claims the Assyrian force was defeated by a destroying angel. The Assyrians were the dominant power in the world for much of the 7th century BC, just as they were for the last half of the 8th century. However, after the death of the king Ashurbanipal in 631, the Assyrian Empire began to decline, and the Chaldeans rose to power. The Chaldeans were an ethnic group that actually originated somewhere in Syria, but settled in what is now southern Iraq near the Persian Gulf. After Ashurbanipal's death, a Chaldean chieftain named Nabopolassar took the throne of Babylon, a highly significant and symbolic title. With the aid of his allies, like Elam and Media, two Iranian peoples who likewise detested the Assyrians, the new Babylonian king was able to wage a successful, prolonged campaign against the Assyrians. The Babylonians added allies, including the Scythians and Cimmerians to the north of Assyria, and they continued to fight against Assyria and its ally, Egypt. It's worth noting that the Assyrian king Esarhaddon had taken control of Egypt from the pharaoh Taharka, who is actually mentioned in 2 Kings 19. But by the late 7th century, after the death of Ashurbanipal, the Egyptians were essentially independent. They preferred a weak Assyria to a resurgent Babylon, so they were supporting Assyria against their enemies. But by 620, the Babylonian forces were clearly the power on the rise. And in 612, the Medes sacked Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. And in 605, at the Battle of Carchemish in Syria, the Assyrian Empire was essentially destroyed for good. Judah was now torn between Egypt and Babylon, sitting at the crossroads of these two major competing powers. The kings of Judah sided with Egypt, but they were ultimately destroyed by the second Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar II. Nebuchadnezzar's forces destroyed the city of Jerusalem and its temple, and deported much of the Judahite population to Babylon, marking the start of the Babylonian exile and the end of the Iron II period in Judah.
You can already see that Iron II is a critical period in the history of Israel. It's the time of the united monarchy under Saul, David, and Solomon, as well as the time of the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah. The archaeology and history of this period is the direct context of much of the Old Testament's history, and a huge portion of the Old Testament is set during this period. Now, the most obvious books that take place during this period are the books of history, Kings and Chronicles. These detail the history of these kingdoms. Most of Israel's prophets wrote during the time of the divided kingdoms, including Isaiah, Jeremiah, and most of the minor prophets. Their writings speak into the political dealings of the kings of Israel and Judah and warn against becoming too closely entangled with the powers around them. The Book of Lamentations is written as a lament for the loss of Jerusalem, the event that marks the end of Iron II in Judah. The Iron II also is the time when much of the Old Testament, or at least its sources, were written down. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah sponsored a lot of scribal activity, and this is reflected in the book of Proverbs. For example, parts of Proverbs are attributed to the time of Hezekiah. Wisdom literature, like Proverbs, was the literature of the king's courts, and we see the influence of wisdom traditions from the surrounding kingdoms on the wisdom literature of Israel. Many of the Psalms date to this period in Israel's history when worship at the temple was active. Finally, it's also possible that during this time, stories which may have circulated in oral or even written form were collated and collected, and these collections became the core of the books of Joshua and Judges. Parts of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, were also collected together during this time. Large components of Deuteronomy were almost certainly written during the time of Josiah, since it represents an adaptation of the Levitical law to the urban life of Israel that didn't exist until Iron II. You can see that the Iron II is important, not only for our understanding of the events that took place during this period, but for understanding how we got most of the Old Testament that we still have today. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, we've included some references and resources in the description below. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like it, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook and Twitter @BeneathTheBible. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.